What is oppression? And are you oppressed? Well, let's start with the word oppress. It comes from the Latin oppressus, which means to press against, to squeeze, to suffocate. But it is more than that. I mean, oppression is both an action and a state of being. Oppression is a physical threat and a psychological state. It is something done to you and something you always carry with you. Oppression is a present effect and a future fear. In real fear. But oppression is also a tool used by the oppressor and not just in the way you might think. See, every time a protest is disrupted, every time a journalist is detained, every time an election is invalidated, every lynching, every burning, every mass arrest, every mass murder and attempted genocide, every act of oppression is always presented as justified, as an act of national or cultural defense, of patriotism, of saving a country, of making it great again. And people will accept being oppressed as long as they think that somebody else, somebody they've been told is a dangerous traitor, as long as they think they're being oppressed more than they are. And don't get me wrong, there is real oppression. But I'm talking about the manipulative crap that convinces people that punching down is how they can fight their own oppression rather than punching up. Hey, here's something that might surprise you. Remember the Romans? Of course you don't. You're not that old. But remember the Romans? Did you know the Romans frequently felt oppressed? And not just by their crazy-ass leaders, no, but by everyone else. See, if you read Roman history written, by the Romans, you'd think they were always under siege, always the underdog. Seriously. The Roman historian Livy's work, it is so full of the Romans saying that they gotta defend themselves against some tiny-ass village or some king way the hell over there, making you think that Rome was always that close to being snuffed out. The Romans told themselves they were the underdog, the little guy being pressed down, that they were oppressed. Maybe they were, at the beginning, when the big bad Etruscans and Greeks and Carthaginians and Gauls were fighting for control of the Italian peninsula. But when the wheel turned and the Romans started invading everybody else, they were not endangered or oppressed anymore. But, see, they told themselves they were. Because when the little guy fights against oppression, anything is justified. No one wants to see themselves as a bully. They want to see themselves as righteous, heroic. They want to see themselves as punching up against some powerful opponent, not punching down. So, oppression has always been justified. Which brings us to the Romans feeding Christians to lions. Damnatio ad bestias, which means condemnation to beasts. Now, the Romans, they fed a lot of people to a lot of lions, not just Christians, because it wasn't about religion. It was about the Romans being convinced by their leaders that these people had committed a crime against the state. See, like when Nero blamed the totally powerless and innocent Christians for the fire that burned down Rome. They hadn't done it. But the Christians were a new, secretive cult, so it was easy to blame them, convict them, and boom! Damnatio ad bestias! Arr. Roman citizens accepted their own oppression. They accepted, what I mean by that is, they accepted that any of them could, at any time, be snatched up and thrown to lions, a clearly crazy punishment. But it was okay with them, because they believed getting eaten by lions and torn apart by wild animals in front of a cheering crowd would only happen to un-Roman traitors trying to destroy the empire. Oh, and I should also say, a lot of these Christians, they weren't from Italy. So they were kind of immigrants. In the year 250 AD, the Emperor Decius signed a law that said all Romans had to sacrifice to the gods, and if they didn't, they were traitors. See, Decius's wars against the Goths weren't going so well. So he told the Senate it was a sign the gods weren't on Rome's side because of a lack of incense smoke. Rather than just accepting that he was a shitty general. Now, the Christians were just one of the groups that didn't want to sacrifice to the Roman gods. And Decius didn't particularly hate the Christians. He just wanted to distract everyone from his shitty generalship. But the Christians were just good scapegoats, easily blamed for battlefield losses, just like they had been for the burning of Rome. A lot of leaders do that. They try to distract you from the terrible-ass job they are doing as a leader by whipping up some bullshit excuse to throw some people to the lions, or into a fire, or into a prison, or into a concentration camp in a swamp. The trick is to make the average citizen, even if they are citizens of the most powerful empire, to make them believe the only thing holding them down or back is those people. And those people don't deserve to be citizens. No, they don't deserve due process. They should be thrown to lions, or at least thrown out of the country. Now, when Emperor Decius passed his sacrifice to the gods or be lunch law, it wasn't about religion. It was about treason. It was about patriotism. It was about pledging allegiance. It was about being a red, white, and blue Roman. And if you weren't going to burn a little incense to help our brave soldiers, your traitorous ass deserved to be torn apart by giant cats. The Emperor Decius died a year later in a swamp, killed by the Goths, because he was just a shitty general. And the gods weren't going to be on his side no matter how much incense the Romans burned. Oh, and the average Roman? They were oppressed, but not by the Christians or any other minority. They were oppressed by Decius and by the aristocracy. Anyway, a dozen years later, Emperor Gallienus proclaimed freedom of worship for everyone throughout the empire. Freedom of religion. Because clearly he was not in Oklahoma. The point is, the Christians, like a lot of other minorities, were oppressed and publicly murdered as a distraction because the empire was crumbling. And the emperor needed somebody to blame. But despite all the lions and tigers and bears, oh shit, eventually the Romans ended up with, of all things, a Christian emperor. At which point, having suffered all that oppression, did the Christians understand what it was like to be stomped on, tortured, and killed simply because they were a powerless minority? And now that they were in power, did they spread peace and religious freedom everywhere they went? Oh, hell no! They spent the next 1,400 years torturing, maiming, and boiling everyone and anyone who didn't adhere to their religion of love. The only reason they aren't famous for throwing people to lions is because they were much more into burning people alive. And how did they justify all that cruelty? Because they still felt oppressed by evil. Because they felt in danger, surrounded by a world of witches and heathens and pagans and demons. Oppressed! I mean, not the people in charge. Not the Pope or the kings or the bishops. They didn't feel oppressed. They knew it was all bullshit. They just wanted gold and power. But the average Christian? Yeah, they were oppressed. But not by evil or pagans or demons. They were oppressed by the aristocracy. Okay, as we all know, the United States was, in part, founded by a bunch of slave owners who didn't want to pay their taxes. I mean, yeah, they said it was about freedom. But a slave owner who says they're fighting for freedom is full of nothing but shit. And after 90 years after they said all men are created equal, 90 years of families ripped apart for profit, 90 years of rape, mutilation, torture, and murder, 90 years of some of the worst oppression imaginable, and then the deaths of over 500,000 soldiers in a war to either uphold or end human slavery. The slaveholders finally lost. Kinda. Because after the American Civil War, poor white Southerners became convinced by the loser traitors they'd followed into battle, that they were now being oppressed by Negroes, by carpetbaggers, and Negroes, and the federal government, and Negroes, and Catholics, and Jews, and Northerners, and most of all, Negroes. The same freed black slaves they had held down with whips and chains for so long, they were now holding them down by being free. Now, I know most everyday Confederates had been fooled into fighting for the right to own slaves by rich slave owners, but that's on them for being stupid. And it's also on them that 160 years later, these sons and daughters of the Confederacy still tell themselves that their own grinding poverty could never be caused by the genteel, genocidal white maniacs up in the big house on the hill. And that any black person, no matter how poor, is oppressing them much more than any local white aristocrat. You know, that same white aristocrat who would happily wipe their shoes on a poor white child's face. Now these working class whites, they are oppressed. But not by somebody who works in the field or factory or store or gas station just like they do. They are being pressed down by those up there, by the aristocracy. They've just been fooled by their oppressors into punching down or sideways rather than punching up. And then there's the Germans, because you knew I was going to get to them. Germans have a long history of being oppressed. I know, right? But they really do. See, Germany wasn't even a thing for most of history. And the area where it is today was just a battlefield for much bigger, much stronger kingdoms, all of the kingdoms around them. During the Crusades, Christian armies marched and raped and robbed and murdered their way through Germany on their way to all the raping and robbing and murdering they were going to do in the Holy Land. And after that, the Russians, the French, the Poles, the Dutch, the Ottoman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, Sweden, for fuck's sake. Everybody in Europe fought right on top of the Germans. Heck, during the 30 Years' War, which was a war that was fought mainly in Germany, but between other people, the population in the area was cut down by 50%. Killed by soldiers, dying of starvation and disease. Things were so horrible, they came up with a shitload of bedtime stories to scare their own starving children into staying in the house for fear of them being kidnapped and sold or eaten by neighbors. See, that's what those fairy tales, that's what they're actually about, by the way. Anyway, eventually the Germans convinced themselves that the reason they were so oppressed was because they were actually special. Sometimes people who are oppressed are a really long time, they come to that conclusion. Because why else would everybody so consistently step on them except jealousy? So in the 1800s, the Germans started rewriting their history to make it look like they'd always been amazing but unacknowledged military badasses. That, despite having lost so many battles to so many other nations, it was they, the Germans, who were actually the best. So there. And then, when they actually won the Franco-Prussian War, they were like, see, they told you. Told you we were the best at fighting. See? But then they lost the shit out of the next war they fought, World War I. And they thought, wait a minute. And it couldn't be their fault. I mean, they couldn't be that shitty at being amazing. So it was just like when Emperor Decius was losing to the Goths. They thought the only way they could have lost was because of treason. A betrayal committed by people who lived among them but weren't really German. They hadn't really lost World War I. They'd been stabbed in the back. And because post-World War I Germany was so full of starvation and suffering, the German aristocracy convinced a bunch of regular folks that they were being held down by traitors. But instead of blaming Christians, or pagans, or demons, or Negroes, the Germans were told to blame the socialists and the jealous non-Aryans. And most of all, to blame the Jews. A nation of desperate, defeated, and starving people were told by their upper class that the real cause of their suffering wasn't upstairs. No, it was downstairs. It was down the street. It was in the shops. It was in the schools. It was all around them. Now, I know the Germans were already a nation of anti-Semitic neurotics, but after World War I, they were convinced by their loudest and most violent voices that the ultimate source of their oppression was and had always been Jewish people. So they tried to kill all of them. They tried to kill all of them. Now, the average German was oppressed, but not by Jews. They were oppressed by the aristocracy, by the capitalists, by the militarists. But again, they didn't look upstairs for their oppressors. They looked next door and became a nation of murderers. And like I said, oppression just leads to more oppression. And like we see, genocide leads to more genocide. Because it's all about punching down. Oppressors are cowards. They use fear to turn one section of the oppressed against whoever are the most disenfranchised of citizens. The oppressor frightens their own oppressed followers into gleefully oppressing the neighbors they have been fooled into thinking are oppressing them. Which brings me to Donald J. Trump. Donald Trump presents himself as that most fantastical of characters. An oppressed billionaire. I mean, think about that. Listening to Donald Trump is listening to a man who presents himself as amazingly powerful and simultaneously a pitiable victim. A man with the thickest of skin and the thinnest of skins. A fabulously wealthy man who constantly needs more money. A genius who has to ask audiences to explain simple things to him. An unbeatable hero, always on the edge of defeat. And you know, he says he loves America, while simultaneously saying it's crap. Donald Trump is trying to be all things great and shitty at the same time. Why? I'll tell you why. Because he knows his core followers feel shitty. They feel scared. The members of his cult feel small in front of overwhelming corporatism and like losers in front of an internet of dazzling winners. They are lost in a world of nightmarish modernity and have no power to change course as they hurtle towards a frightening future. They feel powerless. They feel helpless. They feel held down, pressed down. They feel oppressed. But here's the thing. They've been told since childhood that they're special, that their fate is in their hands, that their American whiteness is the most valuable thing in the world, and that it guarantees control over themselves, their fate, and the control and fate of lesser people. So how can these two things both be true? So they want someone who can give them simple answers in a complex world. Tell them how power and prestige, all of that was promised to them by a culture of superiority has been taken away. And they need this told to them by someone who is an idiot savant. Someone who is both on their level and way above them. Someone who sounds like their crazy uncle at Thanksgiving, but also has a golden toilet. Someone they can understand, but who is also incomprehensible. Someone who understands their fear and knows how to direct it. And these average Americans, they are oppressed. But not by immigrants or drag queens or blacks or socialists or gays or Jews or teachers or scientists or artists or late night talk show hosts. They are oppressed by the aristocracy, by capitalism. But they are told by the leadership of both political parties, by the most trusted names in news, by every internet influencer and internet troll, that capitalism cannot be their oppressor. See, it cannot be the corporation that laid them off so it can give the stockholders another dividend. It cannot be the CEO who dodges paying taxes on his billions while schools are laying off teachers. It cannot be the bank that foreclosed on their farm or the hedge fund that scooped it up cheap. And it cannot be the billionaire felon in the White House who is crashing our economy while making hundreds of millions for himself. It cannot be the system that is rigged against them. So, the trick has been to get these average Americans to punch down, to overlook the causes of their own oppression and the oppression of those that they have been tricked into scapegoating. Punch down. You know, the motto of the United States used to be E pluribus unum. It's Latin, and it means out of many, one. You know, all of us working together. But maybe the motto of modern America should be punch down. If you lose your job, punch down. If you lose your farm, punch down. If you're confused or scared, punch down. Poor and powerless, hey, you could still find a way to punch down, but never punch up. Don't even think about punching up. Don't even look up. The only time you raise your eyes is to see the lions tearing someone apart in the arena. And the only time you raise your voice is to cheer. Because that's what oppression is.